Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Archive. Good old-fashioned archive video here. Today we're talking about a subject that I think is near and dear to everyone's hearts who has had the problem of Imperial players claiming that nobody can defeat Titans. Today we are focusing upon defeating Titans without any Titans of your own. Now, a quick reminder from our last video as well, I am having a bit of an erratic schedule, but the main thing that I want to remind everyone is that we have the homebrew drive up at the moment. So, please remember, go to the post channel. There is a spot there for you to submit your homebrew creations, and of course, join us on the Discord and feel free to put your submissions in there. We are running a special challenge in the upcoming month for our annual celebration of the channel and our success so far. And that challenge is for people to create unique Slaanesh and Tzeentch demon engines. So without further ado, and with that out of the way, let's get right to killing god machines without any god machines of your own. Why the hell am I making this video? Well, it's mostly because of something called dominant strategy, aka if something always works in a video game, in war, in combat, or in a board game, the person who is going to win is going to be the person who uses that tactic. Titans are basically dominant strategy made manifest. If you ever have a problem in 40k, at least when the ground game is considered, if you have any problem whatsoever, Titans are usually an effective solution. Now, the main limit on Titans is the inability or the severe lack of ability to create more of them. So with that tiny and arguably ephemeral limitation out of the way, we need to talk about how to deal with this massive problem of how to deal with these damn things when we don't have them ourselves. Now, why would you ever fight Titans without Titans of your own? Well, very simple answer is not everyone has access to Imperial Titans or to an equivalent to Imperial Titans. Now, Chaos Forces may have Titans, but they're even rarer than the Loyalist Titans. Xenos species have their own versions of Titans, but many of them are arguably objectively inferior, especially to the larger versions of Titans. Now, for today, we're going to be talking mostly about general strategy, specific tools and steps that one can go through no matter what faction you are that helps you to deal with Titans. But we will be highlighting some particular proclivities that other factions have when it comes to combating Titans. So why would you ever fight them? Because on occasion, you don't have a choice. Titans tend to be massively on the aggressive. And if you are the defender, you have something to defend, meaning that you do not have time generally to retreat or to abandon your objective unless you are simply doing it out of the sake of self-preservation. So, should you always prepare for Titans ahead of time, especially and extensionally, even if it costs extra time and effort that you may not have? This is a catch-22, it genuinely is, especially for planets that fall out of Imperial favor, either from chaotic reasons or Xenos reasons, or even just separatism. Is it worth preparing for a Titan attack? Most worlds at the beginning are not ready to face Imperial Titans. Quite frankly, they just don't have the firepower, and their defenses are geared towards a traditional style of war. Titans are the exact opposite of traditional. They are a very unique, in fact, hyper-unique force designed for mass destruction on a planetary or at least on a continental level. They are huge, they are durable, and they are incredibly destructive. So is it really worth preparing ahead of time? Because a lot of this video actually comes down to preparation rather than just tactics. It's hard to win with just tactics because tactics require that you have a lot of things like expensive equipment, difficult to maintain forces, and very elite and well-trained units. If you don't have those things, which, let's be honest, outside of Space Marines and very, very advanced separatist worlds, You're not going to. Not everyone has the advantage of being the Vraxian traders. Not everyone has the advantage of being the Severin dominant. Sometimes it's just you and your good old boys backwoods cult against a file of 6 to 7 god machines. And in that scenario, and arguably in every other scenario, yes, you should prepare at least somewhat for Titans. Now, many of these tactics work against all different types of walkers, knights, titans, dreadnoughts, perhaps even some larger armored vehicles like Baneblades, but this is specifically Titans, and we're going to be gearing our preparation steps towards Titans as well. So I would argue that no matter what effort and time you have, whether it's years or months, you should at least begin formulating what your answer to a titanic threat should be. And 90% of the time, I would even argue 99% of the time, you won't have to use it. 99% of the time, the Titans will not deploy to your world. But given the fact, pretty much, or the de facto reality that if they do, if that 1% hits, you are guaranteed to all die, in my opinion, that makes it worth the extra time and effort. And we'll see when we talk through this video that the extra time and effort can vary dramatically based on how much you want to put into your strategy. Finally, do the tactics that we're going to talk about today work against all factions Titans or just Imperials? Well, yes, but we're going to focus upon Imperial Titans for simplicity's sake. These tactics, when used by any faction, will work against any other faction's Titans. There may be some nuances in how you have to set it up. There may be some nuances in the particular or the specific way that those Titans react to these activities, but in short, all of these tactics will work for all factions against all different types of Titans, give or take a little bit. So let's get right into it. The first step is passive resistance. Passive resistance is kind of what I refer to as the steps before we even start. So before you even come into a situation where you're going to be under attack by the Imperium, you should be preparing for Titans by doing the following. Spread out. Diffuse resistance, as a method of passive resistance, causes consistent pressure at a low concentration. That's a bit of a complicated-ass way of saying that you need to not put all of your eggs in one basket. And I'm not even saying spread it out. I mean literally diffuse. It should be impossible for anyone to pinpoint exactly where the quote-unquote majority of your defenses are located. Now, you can do this a variety of different ways, and we'll be going into that further, but one of the major ways, or two of the major ways, is one, make everything look the same. If your enemy can't identify the difference between a las cannon bunker and an infantry bunker, or a vehicle depot and an aircraft depot, if you make all of these things look relatively similar, you ground their energy states, you prevent anyone from being able to track, say, the electricity or the plasma coils in one or another area. Making everything look very, very similar makes it difficult for anyone, including Titans, to identify where a point of, importance is. And the first target that they're going to look for is going to be denied to them. The Titans want to find the biggest, most important thing and destroy that thing publicly and aggressively. If they literally cannot identify where that is, where the most important point is, inside of these defenses, they're going to have to work their way much more slowly and deliberately through your defenses. The other part is consistent. So that's diffuse resistance as a method of passive resistance. So we're spreading out, we're lowering the value of all of the assets, we're increasing the anonymity of our defenses, making it more and more difficult for them to identify a central point or a most important place. For example, if I'm in a hive, I don't want to center everything around the central spire. The central spire is an obvious target. It is the spot where you would expect important things to be located. If you pretty much put nothing important in the spire and you spread it out amongst all of the other sections and layers of the hive city, you have already made the job of Titans about 10 times as difficult, because now they have to find individual and seek individual nodes of the defense and command structure and destroy them individually, rather than focusing fire upon one central point. This has another advantage: consistent pressure in low concentrations. Titans want to have an epic confrontation with your best. They want to engage with what is arguably the best of your forces so that they can destroy them, because unless you are a very elite and powerful force who, again, has access to Titans, and in this scenario, we have no access to Titans, you are going to be using things like super heavy tanks, you're going to be using things like heavy armor, demon engines, demons, etc., and also all different types of Xenos monstrosities, etc. All of those things are going to be below the level of a Titan, aka they cannot face them in direct open conflict, no matter how hard you try, essentially. We'll be talking about ways that they can be used to take down Titans, but the Titan is seeking them out. It's seeking out your strongest so that it can lay them low, because most of the time, it's not going to be able to kill them in a straight-up fight. So, when you spread out your defenses, when you lower the intensity of the conflict, you are able to consistently apply pressure. Rockets, missiles, las cannons, not in huge waves, not in massive spurts from obvious defensive structures, just occasionally harassing fire, distraction, skirmishing. All of these things keep the Titans moving, keeps them on their toes, and keeps them utilizing ammunition and energy in an inefficient manner. Now, you might say, of course, the Titan has lots of energy, and yes, it also has plenty of ammo. That isn't the point. The point is that for every shot that they are expending on a bunker with 5 men and a las cannon, or on a defense line that is essentially just a bunch of chaff infantry, that is one shot that they are not taking at a more important target. So you are effectively buying yourself time by diffusing and lowering the concentration of your assets. Now, we're going to see how that can be used to your advantage later, but that is a preparatory step. You can't do this in the heat of battle. This is very difficult to be like, every single unit that has these types of weapons, you should all be 150 meters apart in separate defensive structures. You can't prep that ahead of time. That is practically impossible to try and do in the heat of battle, especially when Titans are running around. You need to prep this ahead of time, because there is no way that you can do it while you're under the gun. The next part that I already kind of touched on is removing value from single targets. Do not co-locate assets with resources. Do not put tanks next to your ammo depots. Do not put anti-aircraft defenses next to your hangar bays. Do not put fuel depots or food depositories next to your barracks. It's not because it makes it less efficient. In fact, separating them could arguably make your defense less efficient. The problem is that when the Titan sees the tanks, sees the anti-aircraft, sees the food, sees the power systems, they can identify those things as valuable targets, and they will expend ammunition upon them. They are willing to destroy those things because of the assets that you have co-located, put next to the resources. If you do not co-locate your assets, your tanks, anti-aircraft systems, aircraft, Astartes support, elite infantry units, etc., if you don't put them with important resources, they cannot destroy the unit and the resource at the same time. They may run across the unit in by itself, and they may run across the resource by itself, but they should not run across both at the same time, because then they are effectively able to hit 2 birds with 1 stone. And we want to remove that efficiency from their deployment. So again, part of spreading it out is understanding that resources, things that you need in order to keep fighting, should be separated from the forces that they are supplying. Now again, That is counterintuitive, yes, but there are ways around it. Having a robust logistics system will allow you to overcome this. Trucks, runners, slave gangs, people carrying food, ammunition, and supplies are below the Titans' notice, but they can effectively still supply your assets with resources without them having to be co-located literally right next to each other. Next one, never be noticed. Now, this is obvious. Any stealth that we can achieve in the face of a Titan's auspices, in the face of a Titan's auspex rather, is important. Literally flying under the radar in terms of aircraft, but also more directly, when we make defenses, build them in as much as you can. Now, what does that mean? I would like to cast our minds back to the Second World War. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they landed on effectively a pork chop shaped island covered in black volcanic sand that had been bombarded for days and days and days by the Navy. They assumed that basically nothing was left. It had been bombed, it had been bombarded, it had been attacked hundreds of times. And the Navy assured the Marines that there would be no resistance, that the enemy had been either cowed or destroyed. Now, we knew that that wasn't the case in retrospect, that it had basically done nothing, but the Marines did not know. And so the first ambush upon the beaches of Iwo Jima is an absolute hellfest. Why? Because the Japanese had built their structures where the enemy was not able to detect whether or not they had done any damage to them. Remember, Titans are massive. They can pay attention to a lot of things, but at the end of the day, they are controlled by a human being. And a human being, even with moderati around them, even with assistance, and even with the machine spirit, or tech priests, there's a limit to what they can physically intake in terms of information. They cannot follow every tiny detail of the little ants below their feet. This becomes infinitely more problematic when we have already done steps 1 and step 2 with spread out and removing value. Never being noticed also implies following the Japanese strategy. Build tunnels, build networks, build underground and deep beneath the earth connections that allow you to do things that the enemy cannot and will never be able to detect. They may be able to predict it. After the first few days at Iwo Jima, for example, the Marines began to understand that their enemies had deep underground bunkers and indeed tunnel networks that they would have to deal with, and they began to develop strategies in order to deal with them. But before that point, they couldn't predict it, and they couldn't attack it from the air or from the water. You want defenses that the Titan initially cannot deal with, and at best, once they are realized, they can only predict. They cannot monitor, and they cannot track, at least personally. Sending in infantry, sending in army forces, that is separate, but at least the Titan itself should not be able to track the movement of your defenses. One of my favorite ways to do the never be noticed strategy is to utilize underground train networks. Now, these need to be pretty deep under the ground. I would recommend within the second or the third level of a hive, somewhere that a Titan and in fact orbital auspex would literally not be able to see. There are literally hundreds of meters of concrete, dead air, space, and structure between your defensive logistics network and the enemy trying to spot you. Now, of course, after a couple of days, they're going to realize that these train networks are the problem. That's why enemies keep popping up behind them. That's why bunkers that they thought had cleared out are being remanned again, and they're attacking the Titans from behind and distracting them. But they can only predict it until they bring down infantry and manually clear those tunnels. So you get the idea that I'm going for here, right? Spreading, sinking into the earth, protecting yourself simply with mass and distance from these basically impossible to overcome enemies. Now, do not present a target that they like. This is also related to the ones above. Not presenting a target that they like means that Titans, they like big, obvious, dangerous, or quote-unquote hot targets. Hot targets are things like Baneblades. Hot targets are things like massive troop concentrations or huge multi-tiered barricaded walls or bunkers above the ground. Things that to regular infantry are daunting, scary, terrifying, are exactly what the Titan wants to see. They want to see you with a fully organized traditional defense because that is literally their bread and butter to disable. They want you to fill up the hive wall with guns. They want you to build a massive multi-tiered barricaded pillbox system. Why? Because that gives them a very obvious target to obliterate with their massive weaponry. You can see from the picture down here, this Titan is standing over a city. Where is he firing? He's not firing at the lower class buildings. He's not firing at the ground level. He's firing at the big citadel. Why? Because that's the target he wants to see. That's what he wants to see. He wants to see a defensive target that is pulling a lot of energy, a lot of power, that's showing a lot of visible resistance. You know, muzzle flashes, heavy weapons fire, lots of auspex coming in and out of it, a lot of Vox traffic coming in and out of it. They want to see those targets, and they want to obliterate them because they, in their mindset, see those as traditional, basically, areas upon which the battle will turn, as turning points. And if the Titan can simply obliterate them from the field, that's exactly what they want. That's exactly what their goal is. That minimizes the time that they spend on planet, which of course at the end of the day is basically the Titan's goal. Minimum time, maximum effectiveness. So if you can present a target that is nothing like what they like, then you will make their job that much more difficult. So if they like big, obvious, dangerous, or hot, or pulling a lot of energy targets, obfuscate your power field signatures, obfuscate the design, build in your bunkers into civilian houses, build in various sniper or anti-tank positions into areas that are clearly not normal, build as many defenses around your power systems as you can, not just from physical damage, but also from auspex spying. Now, this is hard. It's very much like protecting electronic systems from an EMP. If you want to protect a system from the auspex of a Titan, you have two options. One, you can heavily insulate the energy system and things like power cords, things like massive wiring, and one of the biggest ones, of course, is plasma engines and plasma batteries and things of that nature. If you bury these things in enough difficult, dense materials, concrete, lead, steel, etc., you can either baffle their auspex or you can completely hide them. Now, it's difficult, especially with bigger sources of energy. The other option is to run them very, very inconsistently or seldom. You either split up the route by which the energy is coming to the position, so rather than one big wire coming from the central power grid of the city, you have about 30 or 40 smaller batteries or generators throughout a building that are slowly building up charge to capacitors, which we know exist in 40k. That's basically how the Shadow Sword works, but they're building up to these capacitors that are not detectable by the auspex because they are not generating power, they are storing power. Now, again, you could argue transfer is transfer, they could detect it anyway, but you want to make it look like normal civilian activities. In a battle zone, a bunch of generators with wires running around inside of a hab block is literally normal. That is totally normal and is not even a need for concern. So the Titan would likely not consider it a threat unless they've realized that that's what you're doing. And at that point, you should have already used it to knock out either a Titan or knock out significant portions of their defenses using this tactic. Again, the idea is you have a las cannon on a third story of a random civilian building. You have a foe attack that knocks down the Titan's shields or wounds it in some way. It turns around, goes through what it thinks is a friendly civilian area, and you shoot at head level with the las cannon and deal some real serious damage. It never sees it coming because it did not get the power drain as a threat because it does not present as a traditional target. You want to consider the things that they're looking for and make your position look the diametrical opposite of that. That is the only way to avoid just getting obliterated before you even have a chance to strike back. The last one is very similar to Never Be Noticed. Extend the conflict. Titans want to be efficient, they want to be quick, and they want to be gone before anything else. They want to be gone. They do not want to get stuck into a long fight. Wait out the Titans' deployment. They cannot walk forever. They cannot walk forever. They cannot afford to. The Mechanicus cannot politically or safety-wise allow them to. The deployment of Titans will bring other forces that wish to bring them down or wish to hijack these Titans, including other Chaos forces. So when we are talking about a deployment of Titans, if you can do nothing else, make sure that you last longer than they can afford to be on deployment. I cannot stress that enough. The only way to survive a dedicated deployment of Titans on your world is to outlast them. You are not going to kill all the Titans. Quite frankly, without Titans of your own, you will never kill all of the enemy Titans in a regular-sized battle deployment. It's just not going to happen. Your best option is to dissuade them, to discourage them, to make it inefficient for them to remain on deployment, and more importantly, to outlast them, to remain alive and functional and consistently resistive while the Titans are forced to leave for logistical, political, or threat consideration reasons. So that is the passive resistance, the beginning. That was the beginning. Let's talk about some fun stuff, some underhanded tactics. Now, a lot of this has to do with where we engage our Titans, where we're engaging our target. Terrain variability. What is the best option to engage with enemy Titans with the goal of destroying them? I'm not saying just stymie or skirmish with them now. I'm saying with the goal of destroying, crippling, or damaging them. Islands. Areas with significant differences in, say, the density of the ground, the elevation of said ground, the composition of the earth that they're walking across, and of course, water is always a good option. Now, Titans can straight up ford all the way up to the heads and sometimes above them at certain distances. However, it is more difficult for a Titan to fight chest deep in water than it is for them to fight outside of it. So islands, like we see on Ardesh, are an acceptable position from which to engage Titans. Mountain ranges, I highly recommend for two reasons. One, mountain ranges have the same problems that islands do in terms of elevation and composition of the ground. Larger Titans can walk on mountains. Smaller Titans have to find ways around mountains, or they have to work their way upward. But in any case, there are times where the Titan will be trying to balance itself, or trying to maneuver, and it will be physically limited in the ways that it can turn, the ways that it can move, and how it can displace its weight. If a Titan falls, it can theoretically get back up. But as long as it is touching the ground, there's a solid chance that one, its void shields will not be working exactly the same way that they normally would be. They may be changed in their composition or operation. They may even be deactivated. But in addition to that, a Titan that is essentially either flat on its back or flat on its face for any period of time from falling, either intentionally or because you did something to, either accidentally or because you did something to it, it is vulnerable for that period of time. Mountain ranges for that reason are a good option. Another reason I love mountain ranges is because it gives you, for the first time and probably the only time, an elevation advantage over the Titan. There are areas on mountains that you will be able to look down upon the Titan. It won't be able to target you with certain weapons. You will be able to target more weak spots upon its carapace with your weapons. Also, having that elevation advantage can allow you to set up more elaborate attack tactics. Valleys are another option. Kind of, among the three, I would say one of the worst. Caves is definitely the worst, basically because it is much easier to get trapped and just die because the Titan doesn't care. Valleys are basically between islands and caves. Valleys give you an advantage. They give you the advantage of cover. If you are on one side of a valley and a Titan walks over you or walks by you or even comes down through the valley, you have the advantage that the mountain range gives you, but none of the positional or the chance that it falls over advantages. So you trade off some disadvantages for some of the advantages that a mountain will give you. You get elevation, theoretically. You get cover, absolutely. And in addition to that, valleys are often more consistent, and sometimes man-made on occasion, than mountain ranges. So valleys are acceptable, but they are definitely not preferable. Caves are also, again, barely acceptable and definitely not preferable. Caves limit your visibility. They also limit your speed if you're a mobile force, but it can also limit your enemy's ability to take you down. Now, they can certainly dig you out. There are plenty of Titan weapons that can straight up not only collapse the entrance to your cave, but then completely obliterate the mountain that you are hiding in. The big advantage of the cave is that you can't really be seen all that easily. Now, can you be detected with auspex if you're drawing in a bunch of power or if you have too many people in there causing a thermal bloom? Yeah, absolutely, but there are ways around that. We know that you can baffle thermals pretty easily. Start lighting things on fire around you, and it's going to be pretty difficult for the Titan to see whether those are human heat signatures or heat wash from the giant gasoline fire that is filling the area. Now, do you have the fuel for that? Do you have the ability to do that? Subjective, but you should prep for it. And that arguably applies to all of them. You should be applying the same things that I talked about before, with the targeting and the diffusion. Those will apply to these terrain variability advantages. Minefields plus, this is the next step. Not anti-personnel minefields, nor even anti-armor minefields. You're going with something more like buried ordnance, or IEDs in the thousands of pounds when we want to talk about disabling Titans. Mines have a disadvantage and an advantage against Titans. On the advantage side, they do not have to interact with void shields at all. You don't have to worry about knocking out the void shields first. You don't have to worry about getting inside of them or underneath them. A mine will go off inside of the Titan's shields and damage it directly, because of course the shields do not go through the ground, they merely go to a few feet above the ground. So these IEDs or mines can deal direct damage to the Titan. There is a major problem, however. IEDs, and arguably mines as well, are usually easily detectable by the Titan. Not just because it has other forces around it most of the time, but also because their auspex can usually see things like that. But there are two caveats to this. One, we can go with the same thing that we did for hiding the caves or for hiding our defenses. Put the IED or the mine somewhere where the Titan doesn't understand that it's a mine. For example, if it's going through a hive city, you could put several 500-kilogram bombs in the upper level of an apartment. Or you could put it inside of a civilian streetcar carrying fertilizer, or something else meant to baffle auspex, a whole bunch of chromium dust, for example. It's going to detect chromium dust. It's not going to detect the two giant high explosive warheads. Now, if it was really paying attention to that one car on the street, or if it was the only thing driving towards it, yeah, it would probably notice. But if it is in active combat, and it simply comes across a street with enemies at the other end, it's going to go towards the enemies, and even if a Maserati were to notice the mine, they might not be able to stop the Titan in time to avoid it. So these minefields are, again, much more like en route or off route IEDs. The other option is just to bury that shit really deep, or use explosives that are non-standard. Now, there are various ways to do this. I mean, you could talk about things that are power field generators. You could talk about, like, turning radioactive weapons into, like, a dirty bomb. You could talk about even something as simple as lighting off a plasma generator underneath the thing's feet. All of this can do damage to the Titan. And damage to the Titan's feet are, in fact, some of the most preferable amongst all of the wounds that you can deal to a Titan, because they rely very heavily upon them. However, as mentioned, minefields are hard to pull off, they require a lot of forethought, and they will oftentimes fail, which is why you need to prepare more than a couple. Finally, next up is physical barriers that work. Tall walls are acceptable for visual cover, but the preference is towards incorporating massive physical barriers, like mountains or deep ravines or craters, to actually conceal movement and deployment. There is a difference between cover and concealment. In this case, concealing means keeping it from all aspects. Cover means protecting you from standard weaponry, not of the Titan, but of infantry now, standard weaponry, and then theoretically masking your visual signature from the Titan. Let's look at it like this. A hive wall is probably only 30 to 40 meters thick, if that, probably thinner than that. That is going to conceal your visual deployment of, say, tanks to the area behind the gate. But it will not conceal the aspects of those tanks. It will not conceal the gas that they are using. It is not going to conceal them from the Titan's sight, so to speak. They will be aware that they're there. Even though they cannot physically see them, and you might be able to pull off some shenanigans as to what vehicles you put there. Maybe you put in something super spicy and special because they can't visually see it. You can surprise them, but you want to incorporate massive physical barriers. Putting entire mountains or huge deep ravines, massive sections of hives or craters between you and a Titan as you move and deploy. That is what keeps them from being able to pinpoint what your forces are and identify which ones need to be destroyed first. If you have multiple threats to a Titan, you need to keep them obfuscated from aspects, because the moment that you don't, the moment that they can actually assess that there are threats here, not only do they have a chance of identifying them and quickly eliminating them, they also have a very high chance of just backing off and letting other forces deal with them. The efficiency thing runs both ways. As the defending force, we cannot afford to have our only anti-Titan weaponry be squandered or destroyed by the Titan's escorts. And in the case that the Titan retreats from what it sees as an ambush, that is a horrible blow. We can't afford to let them get away. So we need to put in physical barriers that actually work to keep the Titan unaware of what we have access to. Now, there are, of course, caveats to that. You will have other forces, you will have orbital aspects, but those things can be spoiled, arguably, far more easily than the Titan's aspects. The Titan is on the ground, the Titan has very complex systems, the Titan is receiving information from many systems at the same time. If we can baffle its aspects and the visual representation and the visual information collecting of other forces, like Skitarii, like aircraft, and like spacecraft, we are going to befuddle the lot at the same time. Finally, we get to the last two on the underhanded tactics. How to construct Titan-proof defenses. Consider all of the above when choosing where and how to deploy. Not just what we've talked about this, physical barriers that work, minefields plus, terrain variability, but also the targets and the considerations that we talked about with passive resistance. When you are constructing Titan-proof or Titan-resistant defenses, all of these things need to be holistically taken into account. You need to think about civilian areas that can work as both minefields and ambush sites. You need to consider the power and logistical infrastructure that you need to lay in order to keep your constructed defenses and your physical barriers effective. You need to consider fallback locations, defensive locations, retreat routes. All of these things need to be pre-planned, and they need to be centered around terrain that gives you an advantage. In this scenario, you are always at the disadvantage, and we are talking about scrabbling for what few chances we have to effectively resist. These underhanded tactics are required for you to succeed, but they, unlike the others, are focused upon how you can wound or defang the Titan. So that's what you consider. Finally, we get to what I consider the most important part of this video and of the strategy overall: breaking up the Titans and their escorts. This is the initial step. No matter what you do, what defenses you've assembled, what forces you've got there, what strategies and plans you have laid in state, You need to separate the Titan from its fellow Titans and strip it of as many escorts as you can before you engage, or you are lost. This is very important. Titans do not travel alone. Titans do not deploy alone. Titans do not work alone. They do not function as an individual unit unless you force them to. It is unless you force them to. You cannot expect to see a Reaver or a Warlord just walking across the horizon without infantry support, armor support, and Titan support of its own. They do not deploy solo almost ever. So at the beginning of each and every plan, each and every engagement, you should have a force doing one specific job. Split the Titan from the other Titans that you intend to destroy, and split that Titan from its escorts. The best way to do this is carrot and stick. It is a very different strategy to what you might be imagining. The carrot and the stick works like this, and you do this before every single engagement if possible. The carrot is for the Titan. At this point, the Titans have engaged with you. They know that you're preparing your defenses for them. They know that they are aware of what your game is, so to speak, and they are looking out for things that can turn the tide. Arguably, they are desperate to make a difference, because so far this deployment will have been frustrating and difficult. So you offer them their first chance at a real victory. There are many ways to do this. You create a faux target that the Titan wants to attack. Not only wants to, has to attack. That Warlord is looking, searching every single data stream he possibly can, looking for the power source for the orbital weapons battery, looking for the power source for the void shield generators, looking for the garrison of your elite troops, looking for your fuel depot, looking for your food depot, looking for the areas where you've set up anti-Titan defenses. If you quote-unquote make a slip, aka you prepare a false diversionary position, or several of them, you are coaxing that Titan. You are encouraging them. You are offering them a mistake, an accident, an opportunity. And a Titan so pressed, a Titan so abused, a Titan so long kept on the defensive, on the cautionary, will, more often than not, go for that target, because not only is it burned into their mentality to be effective and efficient, but it is also in the Geist, in the spirit of the machine, to destroy what you are offering them. That is the carrot. The Titan, one of them or several, travels towards the carrot. They go towards that area that maybe they know they shouldn't go. Maybe they know it's dangerous, but they haven't confirmed it yet. Nobody's gone here because it doesn't look quite safe. But look, that's a valuable target, and I can destroy it. So they go, bringing their escorts with them. Then you use the stick. Now the stick is very, very specific here. You could effectively consider it like a a razor scooter to the shins, basically. Our goal is to strip the escorts, to keep the Skitarii, the tanks, the infantry, the guardsmen, the mechanized troops, to keep them back. Even if it's just a couple of minutes behind the Titan. We don't want the infantry getting ahead of the Titan, because the Titan's weakness, the things that we've set up to kill them, are going to be detectable and, what is worse, destroyable by infantry a majority of the time. We cannot afford to let these escorts go ahead of the Titan. And you might say, well, of course, the Titan is going to wait. That's the thing. You need to hit it with something that is of appropriate power, that the escorts are stymied, or at least slowed, but the Titan does not feel in any danger whatsoever. Masses of light infantry. I have to say, this is the best way to get it done. There are fancier, more complicated ways of doing the job, but masses of light infantry are the best option. Let's say, scenario here. The Titan, a Reaver in this case, has seen what he believes to be an important power node for the city's electrical grid, essentially something running your factories and your industrial zones. In reality, it's nothing. It's a plasma flare that you've let run for a couple of days inside of a warehouse, and it is actively heating up the area extremely and giving off the chemicals that the Titan would expect from a large power plant. So it goes towards that area. It's bringing with it a couple hundred tanks and thousands of mobile infantry. Now, it would be afraid or concerned if you showed up with a bunch of tanks or a bunch of mechanized infantry of your own. It doesn't care when you throw 100,000 screaming cultists past its feet to slow down the escorts. And the thing is, you don't need it to roam on its own for a couple of hours. All it needs to do is take a couple steps ahead of the infantry and then keep that pace. If it's a minute, 30 seconds, 10 seconds ahead of its escorts, that is a valid opportunity to begin with our next step, killing the Titan. Now, when we talk about Titan death, we're going to move from the things that are more novel to the things that are more surefire. Novel ways. Orbital bombardment. Orbital bombardment. Now, we all saw that one scene from 30K with the lance hitting the giant Titan. Yeah, essentially that. Titans don't like to deploy without full orbital supremacy, but on occasion it does happen. And the opportunity with orbital bombardment is that you can use a ship's primary weaponry to strip the shields from and then cripple a Titan on the ground. This is hard to pull off. You need a ship going very quickly and very quietly over the area where the Titan is, and then you need to find a way to rapidly get a targeting solution and have the luck to actually strike the Titan. This is not easy to do. Arguably, this is literally like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet while blindfolded riding a horse. It's hard, and it's especially hard with ships that are actually fast enough to pull it off, because those ships, cutters, blockade runners, fast escorts, and frigates, don't have all that much firepower. They might have a single broadside of lances or macro cannons. Even the fastest of light cruisers would still kind of find it hard to pull this maneuver off, unless they have Void Supremacy. Void Supremacy is the most effective way to pull this off, but if you have Void Supremacy, you're rarely going to have Titans. Again, 30K is a unique scenario where nobody has true Void Supremacy and there's active Void battles going on while there are ground battles. In that scenario, orbital bombardment onto Titans is more of a reasonable solution because both sides have assets in orbit. We're still fighting over who's in charge of space, but those Titans are needed on the ground. So they may deploy where in 40K, they absolutely would not deploy without Void Supremacy. No way in hell are they going to risk getting orbitally obliterated. So orbital bombardment is one. Another one that I consider very novel and I actually kind of love because it's a little bit, not encouraged, but rather inspired by the Contact Harvest book, is orbital weapons from the ground. This is where a flexible or hidden orbital weapon or piece of orbital ordnance is essentially used at point blank. Now, on hives, and also on many structures like spaceports and just put on the ground in some hives or in some megastructures, there are orbital weapons. Usually these are macro cannons, missiles, plasma, or even lances. These are flexible. They have far greater ranges of fire and angles of fire than fixed broadside weapons do. This is because they are meant to deal with lighter targets that are actually more mobile. These can theoretically fire at a 90-degree angle to the ground. If they can fire at a 90-degree angle to the ground, you can use them as an anti-Titan weapon. Now, this is clumsy and cumbersome and hard to pull off. 100%, I agree. Difficult, though, does not mean impossible. And especially with some modification, this could be a surprise. If the enemy, if the Imperium, doesn't know that you've been modifying the orbital weaponry in order to have them fire at a 90-degree angle to the ground, and they're walking around with Titans, and all of a sudden, an orbital macro cannon flattens to 90 degrees and shoots at a Titan with low shields, that can cripple it in a single volley, or maybe even a single shot if you're lucky. These orbital weapons are massive, literally hundreds of centimeters in caliber, bigger guns even than fit on anything but the largest of Imperator Titans. They are very much equivalent to many Titan weapons, and thus it is very much like turning a Titanic weapon against these god machines. So orbital weapons from the ground are a little bit more complex, maybe a little bit more of a crapshoot, but they are surprisingly devastating, especially because they are essentially used at point blank. These are guns that are meant to be fired up into the atmosphere, literally hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, and if we're using them at 500 meters, or even 5,000 meters, they are going to be hitting at their absolute maximum possible effectiveness, meaning that even if the Titan has its shields up, it likely will not for long, because of course the void shields on the Titan are very different from those on a naval ship, just in terms of scale and power supply. The next one is physics kills. Now, physics kills I've talked about with things like Marines before. Dig a pit or find a hole and drop them. Titans are massively heavy. They cannot always detect things under the ground. It's difficult to detect voids or areas where they cannot step. Especially if they are in a hive with multiple levels, it is possible to drop them down multiple levels at a time, hopefully, or at least theoretically, burying them in the rubble. Now, this does not kill the Titan. Arguably, this just pisses it off. However, it certainly does make it much more difficult for that Titan to do its job. And also, it puts a giant hole in the ground, so there is that as well. And then the secondary one for physics kills is hit him with a ship. Literally, take a freighter-sized vessel and ram it into a Titan. Now, you might say, why isn't this done more often? Freighters are cheap, they're everywhere. Two reasons. One, freighters in atmosphere are relatively slow, so even if you did manage to shoot down and run at one at the atmospheric level, you would have a hard time hitting them, because those ships have a harder time moving in atmosphere than they do in the void. So the Titan could easily sidestep it most of the time. The other thing is, some Titans, the ones that are big enough that they would have a hard time sidestepping a ship, they have weapons that can actually knock out the ship in response. For example, Imperators and Warlords all carry weapons that are equivalent to flexible lances, basically. So if they're against a freighter ship, they could easily strip it of its voids with a little bit of help, and then disable the ship itself by shooting out the bridge, or damaging the engines, or damaging the gravity repulsor, so you could effectively cause the entire thing to crash into the ground without actually hitting the Titan. So this is definitely like a last-ditch suicide effort, but it can be done. It is also very difficult to control these ships in atmosphere, especially the lighter ships, especially if you're not well trained. So hitting them with a ship, while it's a good idea, it is not necessarily foolproof. Arguably as well, this does apply to collapsing large buildings on top of Titans, but you need like particularly large buildings, and the amount of explosives and pre-mining that you would have to do is usually cost prohibitive. So I would leave that as, yeah, not likely to work. Void shield shenanigans is another one. So the difficulty here is getting a strong projector, but it can work to cut the Titan in half, maybe. Here's the thing. With void shields, we know that they can flex and change their form, not quickly, but at least they can be pre- and reprogrammed to different shapes and sizes, and also thicknesses and layers. This means that, as per the rule that we established with the void shields for ships, you could cut a Titan in half with a void shield, if it had weaker void shields than your void shield. The problem is, most void shields for cities are not like those for Titans. They don't go to the ground. Usually, they go just beyond the roof of the hive, designed for orbital bombardment and for artillery bombardment into the hive. Oftentimes, if a hive has a wall, it literally stops right above the wall. So you can still hit the wall itself, but there's a shield above it which prevents you from hitting the top of the wall and then the inside of the hive. That means that a Titan and the Titan's void shields are not really able to be struck with the void shield. So we're talking more about individual projectors, or we're talking about using a conglomeration or a different variant of void shields in order to try and cut or use that wave, ripple, bubble, burst pattern of energy spread, that warp cutting edge that we talked about with the void shields in our shield video and also in our one of our ship videos, using that to try and damage the Titan. This is definitely a maybe. It relies very heavily on complicated use of the arcane system that is the void shield itself, but it can be done. It can work. It can be effective, especially if you're able to use individual, very powerful projectors. So, for example, there are examples from the Sabbat Worlds Crusade where powerful void shield projectors are used to cut men and tanks in half. They are caught between areas, and the void shield projects, and it cuts everything that it was touching or that was in the way of its connection in half. Could you do that to a Titan when it was walking through something like a hive gate? Theoretically, yes, but the void shield that you projected would have to be more powerful than the Titan's void shields. And likely you could argue that it needs to have more layers, because if you're talking about a Warhound that has like 2 to 3, Reavers have like 3 to 5, Warlords have like 10 or so, and then Imperators have, I don't know, somewhere in like 20. It's a lot. But in order to cut through all of those and actually damage the Titan, you would need something powerful enough. And the issue again is, do they detect the power spike and the projectors and the power feeding those projectors? I think 90% of the time, they're going to see that shit coming if it's a smaller projector. But there are ways to distract, there are ways to obfuscate, and you could always use the idea of using the actual projector for the hive itself in order to do this in the first place. Or for ships, that is an option as well. Finally, boarding the Titan. We're going to talk more about that in the next couple of slides, but this is one of the most desperate tactics. It is hard to get on the Titan. The thing is protected by its own private army. It is massive. It is fast. It does not care about things getting up inside it for the most part because it has defenders and defenses and gates and walls. But there are ways in. If there's a way out, there's a way in. And there are many ways into the Titan. So, moving on from the odd and the novel into desperate measures. When all else fails, when you are forced to engage in combat, here is what you have to do. Boarding a Titan. This requires flexible or stealthy troops, preferably able to fly, with anti-tank guns or just anti-tank weapons in general. They need to board on the carapace on the back. Then they need to find a way inside. You have to disable bit by bit. Once you are inside of the Titan, treat it like you're inside a void ship. You go for the power systems and the control systems first. The bridge and the plasma core. Those two things, much as if you were on a ship, are your primary targets once you get inside. Those two go hand in hand. The next strategies also go hand in hand. Pure attrition, traditional warfare, and the pour it on strat. Pure attrition. This takes a while, but every scratch that you touch the thing deepens. You need to harass. You need to be constantly preventing repair and recovery. The Titan will want to back off once it runs low on ammo, once it receives wounds, once it starts getting exhausted, it wants to back off. If you constantly follow, if you constantly harass light, anti-tank vehicles, always, every single time, on their ass every time they try and resupply, and you harass their allies and you harass their escorts, you can deal massive amounts of damage, effectively using just chip damage. This takes time, and it is insanely consumptive of both ammunition and manpower, because you can bet your bottom dollar that Titan is going to fuck up 90% of the forces that you send after it. But the 10% that live, they're able to do a scratch. And if you keep doing it over and over and over and over for days, for weeks, for months, you're going to do damage eventually. Whether it's intentional or whether it's just operations related, they will break down eventually. All machines do. Traditional warfare. Arguably, treating a Titan in the traditional warfare way, treating it like a tank, is the most difficult way to take it down. However, you can always get lucky. I would rely upon artillery and upon air power to deal with Titans. With traditional warfare, those are your only two saving graces. Knights and tanks are acceptable as like a stopgap or as a force that draws their attention. It is, however, unacceptable to assume that tanks alone will carry the day against Titans. It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. So, traditional warfare, you are going to have to vary your tactics, and you're going to have to give a lot of effort to it, but it can be done. And that goes into our next one. Essentially a combination of the previous two. The pour it on strat. This is a last stand effort. It basically is when all else fails, we turn all of those careful plannings, all those preparations, all those operations, and all those things that we talked about, we throw them at the window. This is not ideal, but you are piling up every gun, every weapon, every launcher, every explosive, and you leave no shell unfired. Everything. Every last round, I don't care if it's pistols, I don't care if it's machine guns, I don't care if it's rifles, I don't care if it's autocannons, you do not let that bitch stay quiet when you're doing the pour it on. You have a Titan in your sights, you have 50,000 men in a massive ring, all equipped with the best weapons you can possibly give them, and you empty those bitches until you are put the fuck down. And even with that, it still may not be enough to do the job. It may be enough, but it's not always. And the Titan may limp away, or it may walk away, but you won't. Pour it on strat is inherently, at least semi-suicidal. It's the end of the line. It's them or you. If you've gathered up all the resources to make pour it on actually viable, this is a last stand. This is you admitting that if they don't walk away from this, you certainly are not going to. And that's why it's the last of the desperate measures. Because amongst all these and their difficulty, you don't get to do the pour it on strat twice. It only works once. For better or for worse. Alright. How does each faction work, and how do these tactics work for or against them? For the Imperials, let's talk about what they have on hand. They have Bane Blades, and they have Space Marines. These tactics are made for these kind of forces. Bane Blades are a massive force multiplier, and they can act as a very effective ambush predator upon Titans in those tight quarters or in those poor terrain areas. Space Marines are great options for borders. Arguably, I would say the only effective option for borders. You could use Scions, theoretically. You could also use Stormtroopers and Mechanized Troops, but Space Marines are definitely your best option. The Talos Valkoran thing of jumping onto a Warhound and dropping a Melt-A-Bomb, we'll be talking about that in the next slide, but these tactics are made for them. It's designed to kill their Titans, and it is designed for their type of troops to kill Titans. For Chaos, you have warp magic on hand. For the love of God, use it. If the Emperor is going to stop you anyway, you may as well call to the Chaos Gods and see what they can hand you. Underhanded bullshit. Always, every time, Chaos's biggest advantage is that they have numbers and that they generally have a lot of time. Preparation work. Chaos arguably has the best chance of utilizing passive resistance to its maximum effectiveness because they have the most time, the most people, and the best understanding of local terrain. Most of these tactics also work against Chaos Titans, however, so that is a disadvantage as well. And most of these tactics do work for them. Eldar and Dark Eldar, they have their ships. They have to use orbital firepower because they do not have Titan-grade weaponry. The other side of this is that they both have various anti-tank weapons of great value. Now, their tactics in terms of countering their Titans require more careful planning, mostly due to their speed. The main thing with Eldar Titans is their speed and the difficulty in targeting them. Things that work against them will work against Imperial Titans, or rather, Imperial Titan tactics only have to be slightly modified to deal with Eldar Titans. The Dark Eldar just don't have Titans, so you don't need to worry about them. But the Eldar and the Dark Eldar are both going to rely upon their heavy anti-tank weapons if they do not have Titans. For example, Dark Lances, even though they are very inferior in terms of range, mounted on vehicles, they are quite effective at harassing enemy units. And then, of course, you will also have the larger lances and star lances that are able to be used by the Eldar, and they have very powerful warp effects. Now, can these go through void shields? Theoretically, yes. But even in that case, they have a limit on how much damage they can actually do to certain classes and sizes of Titans. That notwithstanding, it's still an effective weapon, especially when used intelligently, and not just on the field of battle. For orcs, Morkonauts and Gorkonauts. Now, do these count as Titans? Kind of yes, maybe no. Depends on how you interpret it. But at the end of the day, they also have numerous heavy weapons. The tactics that work against Orc Titans are highly variable. I just have to say that because Orc Titans are the farthest thing from standard and do not really apply to any consistent rules. Now, they have some general design quirks that you could argue they all share, but their deployment and the way that they develop the field are completely different. So I would say that many of these will work, but arguably Orc Titans are the only ones that you can actually defeat with a traditional fight, because they're not going to do anything very complicated. Necrons. Necrons have their heavy weapons and their ships, but the most important thing with the Necrons is that they will favor attritional tactics with their Gauss weapons. Gauss weapons are like the best version for attrition. Every shot from the Gauss weapon, it does not matter. As long as it's inside of the Void Shield, it will do damage to the Titan. It's not like infantry weapons for Mankind, or even infantry weapons for the Eldar or the Orcs, where it might do chip damage or tiny bits of damage. Every Gauss firing that hits the Titan will deatomize some portion of their mechanical being. Now, it might be literally infinitesimally small. I'm talking tiny little pockmarks, basically, for the infantry weapons. But when we get up to bigger guns, to ship guns, and of course to much larger weapons, that's now sectioning off pieces of the Titan and disintegrating them. That is a very effective way to force an attritional withdrawal. The Necrons would be very effective if they simply spaced out their units dramatically and then let the Titans slowly engage, hitting them as they approached, and essentially trading in lives for ounces of metal removed from the Titan. Now, would this, at the end of the day, kill the Titan? Probably not. They would have plenty of time to retreat, because the Necrons are not very fast, but it could theoretically leave them in a situation where attrition takes its toll. The Tau have their mechs, very similarly to the Orcs in terms of just having mechanized heavy units. They also have their suits. These folks are going to favor boarding, and they're going to favor the pour it on strategy. Now, there's two reasons for this. One, railguns. Two, plasma. They favor boarding because they have a lot of flying and or airborne and or aircraft units. They have the ability to get onto the Titan. All they have to do is get inside. I don't think breachers are incapable of that. Whether or not breachers are actually capable of taking the damn things once they are inside, that's a little bit more subjective. But pour it on with railguns is a great strategy. Large heavy plasma weapons, use of orbital or of aircraft weapons to destroy the enemy's shields, and then utilizing railguns in mass numbers. Now, I'm not talking like, 3 or 4 tanks, a unit of rail. I'm talking like 30 of them here. If we're talking about taking down a Reaver, I want you to have 30 plus Tau Mantas, basically. I want you to have that many railguns, because that's what you're going to need to put down a Reaver. Anything to the central body, you're going to bounce. Like, I'm not even joking around. You are going to bounce. The railgun is just not going to do anything, especially at range. And the Reaver is going to obliterate every single thing that fires at it. The main thing that you're trying to do is hit a vulnerable spot. Arms, legs, joints, weaponry, head, bridge, sections of the legs, sections of the power pack. You need to pour it on. You are effectively sacrificing all of these elite anti-tank weapons. But there's a high chance that you hit something lethal. So, pour it on with railguns, probably your best option. For the Tyranids and Genestealers, life's a lot harder. They have to rely on Bio-Titans and kinetic solutions. Their only real option is swarm tactics, which we're going to talk about in a bit. For generic Xenos, including the Votann, specialized AT, the Votann have their teleporting rail weapons. Those can kind of work, but it's a little bit like a teleporting crossbow bolt. Yeah, it's going to do damage inside of the Titan, but it's damage that can arguably be easily fixed from inside, and it's not going to cause any visible wounds, thus not actually weakening the protection of the Titan itself. Occasionally, Xenos will have warp magic. They will, of course, have ships, but they will generally favor orbital bombardment where they have ships, or they will favor boarding, because that is their only option. Again, many Xenos species do not have the numbers to combat the escorts. They will rely upon boarding. Many of them do not have the armor or the armor-cracking weapon to deal with Titans, so they, too, will be forced to rely upon boarding. All right, let's go on to our last one here. The best ways, be-all, end-all, to kill Titans. The most effective, the most efficient. Listed from the lowest to the highest level of efficiency. The lowest form is starve them out, aka ignore the Titan. Let it spend its time uselessly while you hide or while you run. Now, they're going to do everything in their power to draw you out. They're going to do everything in their power to try and engage you in a fight. They're going to obliterate, they're going to destroy, they're going to attack civilians, they're going to destroy every piece of infrastructure you have available. They're just going to walk and crush and walk and crush for days, weeks, months, even theoretically years, hoping that you appear, hoping that you come out to fight. And they'll be sending infantry in every single place they possibly can to try and find you. But if you bury yourself deep enough, if you draw them in enough directions, if you force them to remain, and not just to remain, but to remain useless, keeping them impotent, keeping them frustrated with the battle space, that is encouraging, and not just encouraging, but eventually mandating that they will be forced to leave. Now, I'm not saying that it's 100% effective. It is, of course, the lowest form of the best way to kill Titans, but this is the one scenario where you can defeat them without major losses to your own force in terms of lives. In terms of infrastructure, defenses, solid defenses, infrastructure, factory production, yeah, all of that stuff is fucked, but in terms of actually having people get killed, this is the best option. So if you care about human life, there's your choice. The next one up is swarm tactics with flexible forces. Now, I talked about this again with like Genestealers and such, but my best versions of this are the Talos Valkoran method, which is just Space Marines with melta-bombs jumping on or jump packing onto a Titan, planting it somewhere, and then immediately jumping off and having it go off. That's effective, it's quick, it's difficult to pull off, there's a high chance of failure, but it could easily cripple a Titan with just one maneuver. And then demon engines. Demon engines come in a large number of varieties, and more importantly, in a large number of sizes. Now, sizes is important here. We want multiple sizes. We want the thing that the Titan wants to engage with that has a little meat on it. Maybe it's a little bit nurglish, maybe it's a little bit tough. And then we want some fast boys. We want some Slanesh. We want some Zeech. We want some stuff that can quickly scuttle up to the god machine, climb aboard its legs, climb aboard its face, jump onto its carapace, and disassemble it. Now, is this easy? No. Does this have a high failure rate? Yes. Is it about equal in terms of failure rate to the whole Space Marines with melta-bombs thing? Yes. Which is why it is in the swarm tactics with flexible forces. You have the folks who are already good as flexible forces, and you are encouraging them to attack in large numbers in a swarm attack, with the goal being to disable or destroy the Titan. Teleportarum strikes and warp-related shenanigans. The goal is essentially, if you have warp talents, if you have terminators, get in, Teleportarum or Warp Jump style, and get out quick. You get in, you destroy the engine, or you kill the Moderati and the controller for the Titan, and you fuck right off. In this way, you are attacking an enemy who doesn't know you're coming, who you didn't have to deal with all of their escorts first, so they didn't get to waylay you or hamper you, and you are effectively able to go directly to the more pointy end of the attack the most quickly. Is it difficult? Yes. Does it have high chance of failure? Yes. Is it theoretically sacrificing very expensive units? Yes. Is it still worth it with all of that? Arguably, yes. Arguably, yes, it is, considering your alternatives. Yes. Another kind of theoretically bloodless and quick way to put Titans down. Difficult? Yes. Impossible? Absolutely not. And then finally, the highest form of the ways to kill Titans without Titans are dedicated engine killers. The only vehicles that are up to the task. Bane Blades basically stand amongst all others as superior. They are ambush predators in the anti-Titan role. If you have a volcano cannon, that is basically your equivalent of a Yag Tiger. It is going to be the tank that kills everything. It's going to be the kill shot. It has one good, overpowering, arm-destroying, vehicle-crippling volcano cannon shot. And then it has to go cold. It has to recharge. And before you even begin that shot, you need it to be cold. Cold, dead cold. Buried under the ground. Covered in thermal blanketing. Covered in different types of generators, protected in urban and in deeply entrenched terrain. You cannot have a Bane Blade in the open. Even a standard Bane Blade is still a severe threat to all but the largest of Titans. Against a Reaver, a Bane Blade is a threat. It has the ability to knock out its void shields, and it has the ability to damage and or kill the Reaver. Against the Emperor class, it simply doesn't have the range generally, and you will more consistently have to rely upon the more heavily armored volcano cannons and all the other types of heavy anti-tank versions of the Baneblade. But the Baneblade really is the best one-hit killer and direct shot wonder against Titans. The next ones are the Knight. The Knight is a skirmish predator against Titans. It cannot, I repeat, cannot stand up to Titans in a one-on-one fight. Even in this scenario that you have here, a large Knight Gallant against a Warhound Titan. Good scenario. Warhound has no shields, Knight Gallant is at close range, manages some good shots off. That Knight is still probably going to die in direct combat with a Warhound. It is just the differential in firepower. Now, when we get up to the heavier versions of Knights versus the Warhound, it's a little bit more even, especially at long range, depending on what the Warhound is equipped with. But the best way to ensure success in terms of killing a Knight, or in terms of killing a Titan with a Knight, is urban warfare. Get within the buildings, get within the streets, find visual cover, and ambush the shit out of smaller and lighter Titans. Warhounds and Reavers. That's really where your prey stops. You cannot deal with warlords. You will die. There is no two ways about it. You are cooked against a warlord. Don't even talk about Imperators. Even the Baneblade, even the best of the Baneblades, will struggle or be impossible to kill Imperators. But with the Knight, you need to stop at the Reaver. The Reaver is a powerful enemy, and the strongest of Knights would struggle against it. And you need urban warfare. You cannot do this in the open. It is impossible. The Baneblade has the opportunity to do it in the open. It has to be prepared to do so, but it has the ability if it protects itself and hides itself enough. You do not, because you cannot. You cannot hide yourself. So you cannot engage in open terrain. Baneblade can, you cannot. The last one is the Plasma Pult or other saturation heavy weapons. The Plasma Pult is pretty much unique to Urdesh. It is essentially a gigantic plasma mortar. It fires a tens of meters wide plasma ball similar to a catapult in a wide arc, and it is used to clear large areas of ocean, boil sections of the ocean, and of course to defend against and to be intercontinental artillery from the coastline that is well defended. It is put to use against Titans, and it is relatively effective. The main thing to consider with these saturation type weapons is you need lots of them, and they are a expressly and arguably exclusively defensive weapon. They work best against warhounds, but they can menace and threaten Reavers as well. Now, I do not think that the Plasmapult is a danger against Warlords. I would even argue that against a Reaver, a single Plasmapult is simply going to be disassembled. But 5 of them against a Reaver, now that's a little bit more of what we're talking about in terms of fairness. The advantage to these Plasmapult and similar types of saturation weapons is that you can make and bring more of them to many conflicts than the Baneblades or the Knights on average. So those are the last of the engine killers, some of the most important ones. Now, obviously, other factions do have their own, but you can apply similar tactics to these. You may ask, I have not included the Imperator as one of the things that can... Don't kill the Imperator, it's just not going to happen. I really hate to say it, because, the Mayor's so stupid, mass consumption, completion, big Titan go... The Imperator is just so unbelievably overpowered. The Warlord is already bad because it's essentially a walking battleship. The Imperator is worse. The Imperator is a walking intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile. It does not fucking care about any other vehicles that exist. So, just consider that, and your only option there is like orbital weaponry, basically. The Imperator just does not care. It is impossible to take that thing out without Titans. Or some of the more disgusting underhanded tactics that we've been talking about. Engine killers, basically you need to stop at the Warlord, almost all of you, unless you have large numbers or significant advantages that I can't really even elicit to you at the moment. So, again, the Imperator, still without peer, the most powerful vehicle in all of 40k that could be argued to be a standard design. Yeah, sorry, I made a long video on them for a reason. Alright, so... very glad that I got this one out to you. It's been an absolute pleasure to make. I was super happy to get it. Credit goes to GW, of course, then Yehanna Houchar, John Stone, Sugar Free Artwork, Story Killinger, Neil Estrate, Oliver Wetter, Raider Javor, Aguirre, Kev Walker, and Mark Harrison. Now, as a reminder, we do have the homebrew drive going on right now. It is on our post channel, which is linked in the description. We also have our Discord open, which is also linked in the description. I am planning to have more videos soon. Of course, I'm going to keep the Chaos series going. I'm going back and forth naturally, but there is more Darktide stuff coming up. If you had not noticed from my voice, I am not feeling 100% at the moment. A little bit under the weather. I'm going to do my best to get over this as quickly as possible, and I'm going to continue to make videos as best I can. But understand, I'm going to save a lot of my effort and a lot of my stuff that I'm working on for October the 22nd, which is our channel anniversary. Specifically on that day, I will be having a stream, or possibly the day before it, and then I will be working on our homebrew review, the video that comes after that, which is going to be another showcase of your guys' wonderful artwork and concepts. Now again, that stream is also just going to be a celebration of our anniversary, of our 1-year anniversary of the channel's rebirth. You guys have been absolutely incredible. It's such, honestly, an honor to do this for you guys. It's really such a pleasure, and I do hope that you guys enjoy. So with that said, and with my throat absolutely giving out on me, I wish you all a lovely good night.